Have it. Members, we now move to debate on clauses 26 to 31, and the question is at Part 2, stand part. The Honourable Phil Goff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This Part 2 deals with miscellaneous matters. It deals with the Temporary Safeguard Authority, which is, of course, abolished under this bill. And it's abolished because the responsibilities of the Temporary Safeguard Authorities have been taken over by the Ministry. And Labor put this in the original bill, and it doesn't object to that because it is a more efficient way of dealing with it. And, of course, the purpose of this bill was to promote efficient, transparent and objective investigative and decision-making processes. But I've got to ask the question again, Mr. Chairman, if the purpose of this bill is about transparency and objective investigative processing, can we rely on the government actually to carry out the purpose of this bill? Because it's been anything but objective and transparent with the investigation of the minister who was formerly in charge of this bill. A minister who was known to have taken two donations of $25,000 each, $50,000, and yet omitted to declare those donations to the Electoral Authority. Well, it is about whether the government can be relied upon to be transparent in this way. And I've got to say that there has been no transparency in the manner in which this bill has been dealt with and why this bill has been delayed for such a long time. And I come back to the point that if there was a general agreement across the floor of the House to this bill, can I get the Minister in the chair to stand up and say why it has taken 5 years for this bill to go through? And was it because two at least of those wasted years were because John Banks was in charge of the bill and the government didn't have confidence in what John Banks did in his oversight of the bill, or alternatively because the government felt embarrassed by what John Banks represented and didn't want him sitting where Mr Foss is sitting, because there would be questions about if this bill is about objective investigation and transparency, whether he could be relied upon to ensure that, or whether he would simply be an embarrassment to the government. He was, after all, as Clause 4 of the bill sets out, appointed under the authority of the Prime Minister. But why was the Prime Minister leaving this minister in the chair when he was known to have made a donation and not declared it?
Order.
He had not met...
No, order. Look, I've cautioned the member before. Wayne, we're on. This is a very narrow debate. Part 2 is a very narrow debate, and we're dealing with clauses 26 through to 31. It's a very narrow debate, and I'll ask the member to come back to the provisions of the bill and nothing that's outside the scope of that. Honourable Phil Goff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Under the Temporary Safeguard Authority, of course, had the right to enforce safeguard measures. And while New Zealand is a country that believes in free trade, it believes in not having excessive protectionism, there are circumstances where you need to safeguard the trading interests of your country. And we need to safeguard it when, for example, there is a surge in imports, and those imports could damage our domestic industries, and there is a need for a period of time to allow domestic industries to adjust to that. There are circumstances where there may be dumping by another country. Dumping is a process whereby the country of origin of the exports is actually selling the goods in the New Zealand market at a lower cost than what the normal value is of those goods in their own country. And that is undesirable. And there is another case for having safeguards, and that is the need for countervailing duties, because in some instances we find that the competition from imported goods is not fair competition at all. It's competition that is created by a lack of competition created by the fact that the government in the country that's exporting to New Zealand is actually heavily subsidising those goods. So that's why we set up the Temporary Safeguard Authorities. They were set up way back in, I think, 1987 under a Labor government, and the purpose of those safeguard authorities continued to be relevant. We needed protection against where goods were subsidised or where goods were being dumped, Mr Chairman. And therefore we needed to have a continuation of those functions. But the Ministry now is in a position where it is able to carry out that function. I think it's also fair to say that the temporary safeguard authorities were hindered in their work by the fact that they were given only 35 days to consider whether there was a need for safeguards. And 35 days, frankly, Mr Chairman, wasn't a sufficient period of time, and this bill allows the Ministry that replaces the temporary safeguard authorities to have a period of time of 75 days or, in some instances, up to 85 days, Mr Speaker. So the provisions that are set out in Part 2, I think, are relevant provisions. I think it's worthwhile mentioning too that a number of the amendments made by the Select Committee are sensible amendments. They were accepted by both sides of the committee. That is in terms of, while allowing ministerial discretion in terms of imposing safeguards, to narrow that the breadth of the discretion in order to increase certainty, to allow where a provisional safeguard was set in place and a final duty was not imposed, for that duty to be refunded to the exporter concerned. There were provisions also for countries to be exempted from the provisional safeguards. That's where the countries, for example, are developing countries, and we have obligations under the World Trade Organisation that we should not impose safeguards against them. And clearly, where we have negotiated specific trade treaties, there is a need sometimes to exempt countries from the imposition of safeguard measures. Mr Speaker, Mr Chairman, I think that the bill is sensible. We have got a provision here for transition from the old Act, and maybe the question has to be raised that we are allowing for transitional provisions, but in fact there has already been a 5-year period where this bill has been held in abeyance. People knew that it was there, people knew that it had wide support, but they couldn't understand why the government had held up the passage of this bill for so long. And it is relevant to ask, Mr Chairman, and the Minister has steadfastly refused to take a call on this, why this bill has been delayed for 5 years. This House is meant to expedite legislation. It's meant to be efficient in the way it passes legislation. Why is it that if this measure is important to protection of New Zealand industry and to ensuring fair trade, that we have waited for 5 years? This bill was on the books when the government was elected in 2008. Why is it, Minister, that the government has been embarrassed about bringing this bill back before the House and progressing it? I think the House deserves an explanation on that point, Mr Chairman. I think the country deserves an explanation, and most particularly New Zealand industry needs an explanation as to why the government has delayed this measure. Why was it that his predecessor, and the Minister before that for that matter, has taken so long? I've heard of transitional provisions, and this section deals with transitional provisions. I've never heard of a transition of 5 years when a government is meant to have passed a piece of legislation but has failed to do so. It's not that it was controversial. I think it's supported by all parties in the House.
Point of order, Dr Paul Hutchison.
Understood that this part of the bill is narrow, and I fear that the member is veering away from...
I thank the member. I'm listening very carefully, and I'm taking note of what's being said. And the member has 53 seconds remaining, if he wishes. Honourable Phil Goff.
Thank you. And 53 seconds is such a small period of time, Mr Chairman, when you consider this government has delayed for 5 years the passage of a legislation that it now tells this House it is important to pass. If the Minister won't take a call on this bill, the House is entitled to ask why he is not prepared to do so. Does he not know the answer to why the government has been hopelessly inefficient about passing this bill? Or does he know the answer, and I suspect the whole House knows the answer as to why this bill has been delayed, but he is shamed and embarrassed that it has taken so long because of the inadequacies of the former Minister?
The Honourable Mary Ann Street.